I'm going to be talking to Professor Geoff Mann, who is the director of the Center for Global Political Economy at Simon Fraser University, about COP26, which is well underway now in Glasgow. So welcome to the interview, Geoff.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Appreciate it.
I think, a lot of Canadians maybe could stand with a little bit of just a brief overview of what COP26 is about, why the folks, why 25,000 people have gathered in Glasgow for that, and some of the key issues. So maybe you could start with just a brief overview of what COP26 is all about.
Sure. So COP26 is the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And which was originally established in the early 1990s, in 1994 actually. And since that time, the Conference of the Parties, which is everyone who signed on to the convention, has met 26 times now to try and come to grips with climate change at a global coordinated level. For the most part, those meetings have kind of passed by people's radars without much notice, but a couple of them have attracted a lot of attention. Copenhagen in 2009, Paris in 2015, and this is a big one again now in 2021. It was originally scheduled for 2020. And the point of the COP meetings is to bring together the global powers and all the representatives of many other nations and groups and business to coordinate a global response to climate change and reduce emissions and hopefully fund adaptation to the pressures that climate change is putting on ecosystems and people all around the world.
Now, my understanding is that the COP is the working body of the UN framework and designed for putting in place, negotiating the financing, the policies, the agreements on how decarbonization is going to take place. And that's essentially what they're doing over the 12 or 13 days of the conference. Have I got that more or less right?
Yes, you have. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, what are some of the, maybe three issues, Geoff, that Canadians can say, aha, that's what I should pay attention to at COP26. Now, I'll lead off. I think finance is the big one on today's agenda, and the estimate is that we need $100 trillion of financing to fund the transition to off fossil fuels. That's by 2050. What's your take on that?
So the financing question is a big one, obviously, and it's particularly a big question for lower and middle income countries that don't have access to a significant amount of this funding. The plan, as you mentioned, is to somehow coordinate $100 trillion in investment between now and 2050, and for reasons that I think are complicated but not entirely surprising, private finance, in other words, private firms, not governments, have taken the lead right now on providing this finance. So Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and of the Bank of England, as most people know, has now become a special representative at the UN on climate finance. And he and Michael Bloomberg, the former former mayor of New York, have coordinated a Glasgow financial network that supposedly represents $130 trillion in funding that is now, according to them, available for work toward net zero. This is, as you can imagine, controversial and problematic in many people's eyes on several levels. Firstly, because it puts private finance in charge of this transition. None of this, or very little of this money, is going to be granted. This is all profit-oriented lending for the most part. And it's also, in many people's mind, and I would include myself, a sort of barely credible commitment. Many of these firms, they're all the biggest firms in the world, have pretty gleefully funded much of the activity that has caused the problems. The idea that now we can historically erase that behavior and jump on finance's bandwagon is a complicated one at best. And it's also, I think many people doubt that it will have a great deal of equitable distributional impacts, if we can put it that way.
That's actually an interesting question. I mean, the International Energy Agency is fond of saying that that while government can do so much, the private sector has to step up and provide that capital to make sure that there's enough at the end of the day to get the job done. Is COP26 like a framework within which, you know, governments and the private sector, particularly finance, can come together and wrestle with this issue?
In theory, it absolutely is. In fact, I think that, you know, if we can read good intent in some of the, or much of the organizational structure, that is the plan. Now, for most people who haven't paid a lot of attention, one of the things that might stand out when thinking about COP26 is the number 26, and how many times we've had to do this virtually without any impact on actual reduction of emissions and funding adaptation, especially in low and middle income countries. So the question of whether or not the organizational structure is there to enable some sort of coordinated global response, I think it's hard to say no, but it is also very difficult to say that existing institutions are capable of this transition if we need to come together 26 times, when what that signals is that even the powers that be have recognized this as a problem for 30 years. And, you know, we now know that many of them knew long before that. So I think that it's perhaps the difference between practice and principle here. Sure.
Well, let's go on to the second issue, and that is methane emissions, and particularly from oil and gas production, but also from coal. That got a lot of attention on Monday, Tuesday. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, anybody who's paid some attention to this will know that methane is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. It's a little bit shorter lived than carbon, but in the sense that it stays in the atmosphere a little bit less lengthy amount of time, but it's very powerful. And methane emissions are rising, especially as the globe heat warms up. As people know, many of the methane sinks themselves are thawing, especially in the north, and releasing a lot more methane. So this is a very bad thing. And we need to address it. Boris Johnson, in particular, has put this at the forefront of his breakthrough challenges that he's put forward at the COP, and he's one of the reasons that methane has become something that people are talking about. He's proposing a 30% reduction, I believe, in methane emissions by 2030 globally, which would, of course, involve a great deal of change in the oil and gas sector, as you mentioned. Again, if there's one theme that you know drives mostly that drives most of my analysis of COP right now, and the methane emissions cuts are part of this, is the unfortunately, I believe, quite performative dimension of many of these commitments. The nationally determined contributions to the COP, which are each nation's commitments to what they'll do to help address the problem. These promises like 30% less methane, these are, there's actually zero historical evidence to suggest that there'll be any follow through. So we have to suspend disbelief, I think, in many ways, to believe people like Boris Johnson or Justin Trudeau, to expect that these methane emissions will actually happen via the COP process and the breakthrough challenges. I would love to be proven wrong on this, but this is my analysis of where we're at right now.
Sure, and we've seen promises in the past. I mean, in Canada, Trudeau was promising 40 to 45% reductions. Heck, I remember 2014, 2015, oil sands CEOs were on board for 40 to 45% reductions in methane emissions, and none of that happened. So fair comment. What's a third issue that Canadians should be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, Canadians can, of course, have very specific concerns that deal with Canada's own role in this, and also domestic issues, certainly. And also Canadians, I think, should share the concerns of much of the global population around, the potentially abyssal kind of nature of the climate change problem at the moment. But I would say that perhaps one of the most fundamental, I think, things that Canadians can do here at home is put pressure on our own institutions and governments to follow through on and increase their commitments. Trudeau has along with virtually every other leader of wealthy countries in the world, has, to put it bluntly, lied about this a lot, as have most of the other leaders. And in some ways, one might look at these lies, these promises, yes, we'll reduce emissions while building pipelines and subsidizing the oil and gas sector. We might look at them as, outright fibs. But in some ways, we've got ourselves in a political situation where the lies themselves have become quite necessary to deal with the contradictions between what we know we must do and how we're actually living right now. And so we need to actually call these out and put pressure on our own governments to follow through on these commitments and actually increase them, and not expect the global community to keep calling upon Biden or Trump, not Trump anymore, sorry, Biden, Trudeau, Morrison in Australia. We need to put pressure from below, which I think lots of people are trying to do. This is not in any way to discredit the work of many, many people here in Canada, but I would argue that that's our primary commitment, is to make these people be telling the truth.
Now, I've interviewed a number of experts on this, and including some of your SFU colleagues like Mark Jackard. And I think everybody agrees now that the federal climate suite of climate policies and energy policies have the potential to get us to net zero by 2050. So if I understand your argument correctly, we haven't had enough pressure, but we do have the policy in place. Now we have to put the pressure on the politicians to follow through with the objectives and the policies they have in place.
Yes, I guess I would say I hope to communicate part of that, but I would also say that we actually do not have the policies in place. We have the science and the ideas of what's necessary, but net zero by 2050 is still inadequate. I mean, and that's if we make it. And there's really very little expectation that we will. I would argue, along with a couple of other people, and I'm certainly not, I shouldn't say a couple, lots of other people, that really the fundamental task right now is to wind down the fossil fuel industry. It's not about a managed slow decline to net zero by 2050. I honestly believe that will be too late in terms of emissions. So I would say we have the groundwork for the kinds of policies that are necessary, but I do not feel like the ones in place will do the business.
So in terms of the wind down of the fossil fuel, and that itself, of course, is a big contentious issue in Canada. But in terms of that's coal, oil, natural gas, coal, there are policies in place, I think, to decarbonize the electricity grid by 2030 or 2035. So let's set aside oil and natural gas. You've made the point about that. What other parts of the economy then require a more robust policy in order to decarbonize them?
Well, I mean, as you know much better than me on the energy front, there's lots that can be done there. I think that some of the more important policy arenas in which work can be done are some of the things we don't necessarily directly associate with climate. One might be public transit, let's say, which I guess is sort of more obviously a climate issue in many people's eyes. But well-funded, ideally free public transit in all our major cities would change, I think, drastically the nature of our transportation frameworks. Another is housing, and especially affordable housing, so that we don't have the urban sprawl and the kinds of development that are increasing our reliance on precisely the fossil fuel burning vehicles. So there are several realms in which, well, perhaps many, many, many realms in which investment and policy can make a big difference. But those are the first two that come to mind for me.
Well, Geoff, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Hey, thank you very much. It's really nice to be here, and it's great to get a chance to chat with you.